The archaeological survey vessel Twilight Seeker had been cataloging dead worlds for 300 years before it found Earth. That was not unusual in itself. The galaxy was littered with the ruins of civilizations that had risen, flourished, and vanished into the cosmic silence that eventually claims all things. What was unusual was the state of preservation. Most dead worlds showed the characteristic signs of collapse. Crumbling infrastructure, environmental degradation, the slow, patient work of entropy reducing cities to dust and monuments to memories. Earth showed none of these things. Earth looked like its inhabitants had simply stopped existing between one moment and the next, leaving everything else intact. The Twilight Seeker was crewed by a species called the Archivists, a civilization that had made it their singular purpose to document the lost cultures of the galaxy before time erased them completely. They were scholars, not explorers. They did not seek glory or territory. They sought knowledge, and they approached each dead world with the careful reverence of beings who understood that they were walking through someone else's grave. The expedition leader, a thoughtful individual named Curator Vess, stood in the observation deck and watched Earth rotate beneath them, and felt something she had not felt in 2 centuries of archaeological work. She felt unease. The planet was beautiful. That was the first anomaly. Dead worlds were not supposed to be beautiful. They were supposed to be scarred, broken, choked with the evidence of whatever catastrophe had ended their civilization. Earth was pristine. The oceans were clear. The forests were vast and healthy. The atmosphere was oxygen-rich and completely breathable. Scans showed abundant life, millions of species of plants and animals, complex ecosystems, thriving biospheres. It looked like a garden world in its prime. It looked like a world that should be inhabited. But there were no cities, no structures, no electromagnetic emissions, no signs of technology anywhere on the surface. Curator Vess ordered a planetary survey. The Twilight Seeker dispatched drones to every continent, scanning for anything that might explain what had happened here. The drones found evidence of habitation. Ancient roads buried under vegetation, the geometric regularity of agricultural patterns visible only from orbit, areas where the bedrock showed signs of having been quarried and shaped. But no buildings, no ruins, nothing that looked like a civilization. It was as though someone had taken an entire species' worth of construction, every structure they had ever built, and carefully removed it from existence. The survey team worked for 3 weeks. They cataloged thousands of anomalies. Places where something should have been, but was not, empty spaces that held the echo of absent architecture. And then one of the junior researchers, examining spectral analysis from the polar regions, found something that changed everything. There were structures under the ice. Not ruins. Structures. Massive, intact, and still generating faint energy signatures after what dating analysis suggested was 500,000 years. The discovery triggered an immediate escalation in survey protocols. Curator Vess authorized a full excavation expedition, something the archivists did rarely and only when the potential historical significance justified the risk of contamination. They assembled a team of their best researchers, equipped them with the most sophisticated archaeological tools their civilization possessed, and descended to the northern polar region where the structure signatures were strongest. What they found, buried beneath 3 kilometers of ice in a thermal pocket that had preserved it in perfect stasis, was a facility. The facility was enormous. It extended deep into the bedrock, a complex of chambers and corridors and spaces whose purpose was not immediately clear. The architecture was elegant but strange, designed for beings who stood roughly 2 meters tall, who had bilateral symmetry and manipulators similar to what the archivists possessed but configured differently. The materials were advanced. The construction techniques showed evidence of sophisticated engineering. And everything Every surface, every system, every component was still functional. The facility had power. Not much, just enough to maintain core systems, but it had been running continuously for 500,000 years without any maintenance, without any oversight, without anyone present to operate it. Curator Vest led the team deeper into the facility. They moved carefully, documenting everything, taking samples, trying to understand what they were looking at. The corridors branched and intersected in patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than organic growth. Some chambers were clearly living quarters, small spaces with furnishings sized for the vanished inhabitants, storage units still containing preserved items whose purposes were mysterious. Other chambers were laboratories, filled with equipment that the archivists recognized as scientific instruments even if they could not immediately understand what they were designed to measure. And then, 3 levels below the surface entrance, they found the central chamber. It was vast. The ceiling arched 30 meters overhead, supported by columns that seemed to grow organically from the floor. The walls were lined with what appeared to be display screens, dark and dormant, but still intact. And in the center of the chamber, arranged in perfect geometric precision, were 144 cylindrical pods, each one 3 meters long, sealed, and according to the sensors, still maintaining an internal environment. The pods were coffins, or stasis chambers, or something else entirely. Curator Vess approached the nearest pod carefully. Its surface was transparent, reinforced crystal or polymer, and through it she could see the occupant. The names were diverse. Different phonetic patterns, different cultural origins, suggesting a species that had been geographically distributed, culturally varied. The designations were military: commander, pilot, tactical officer, engineer, medical specialist, communications. The roles painted a picture of a crew. A ship's crew. But there was no ship. Just the facility, buried under kilometers of ice, its occupants sleeping in formation for longer than most civilizations existed. Curator Vess found the central pod, the one at the very front of the formation, the command position. The display above it showed a name that the algorithm translated approximately as Captain, and a personal designation that came through as something like Chun Iko, or Iko Chun, depending on how you parse the linguistic structure. The occupant was female, or at least presented characteristics that the archivist's biology databases classified as likely female. She looked young. She looked human. She looked like she had closed her eyes yesterday and expected to open them tomorrow. Curator Vess stood before that pod for a long time, feeling the weight of a mystery that seemed to grow heavier with every answer they found. These beings had built this facility. They had entered these pods. They had activated some kind of preservation system that had kept them alive for an impossible duration. And then they had waited. Waited for something. Waited through the rise and fall of entire stellar civilizations. Waited while their world healed, while their cities vanished, while every trace of their civilization except this one facility disappeared into the patient work of geological time. Waited with a discipline and a purpose that suggested they knew exactly what they were doing. The question that Curator Vess could not answer, the question that would haunt her for the rest of her career, was simple. What were they waiting for? The Twilight Seeker remained in Earth orbit for 6 months, while the research team worked to understand the facility. They were careful. They were professional. They documented everything according to strict archaeological protocols. They did not disturb the pods. They did not attempt to access systems they did not understand. They treated the site with the reverence it deserved, as a tomb, or a monument, or perhaps something else entirely. But the more they learned, the less sense any of it made. The facility was not alone. Once they knew what to look for, the survey drones found others. Identical installations at both poles, buried at precisely the same depth, containing exactly the same number of pods, all still powered, all still maintaining their occupants in that strange state of half-life. Then they found the equatorial facilities, different architecture, different design, but the same purpose. More pods, more sleepers. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. All arranged in military formations. All perfectly preserved. All waiting. Scholar Keth made the breakthrough in the 4th month. He had been working obsessively on the translation problem, feeding every scrap of text they found into the linguistic algorithms, building a database of symbols and patterns. The facility was full of text, labels on equipment, instructions on panels, documentation in storage systems. Most of it was technical dry, the kind of operational material that any complex installation would need. But Keth found something different in one of the command chambers. He found what appeared to be a personal log, recorded in a combination of text and audio that the facility's systems had preserved perfectly. The audio was incomprehensible, a language spoken by vocal structures the archivists did not possess, in frequencies and patterns they had never encountered. But the algorithms could work with it. Given enough time, enough samples, enough context. It took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of constant processing, of feeding the system every linguistic pattern it could derive, of building a framework for a language that had not been spoken in 500,000 years. And then, late one night by the ship's chronology, the algorithm produced its first translation. Not perfect. Not complete. But enough. Enough to understand. The voice belonged to Captain Shin. The recording was dated. Though the dating system was unfamiliar, the context suggested it had been made just before the facility went into its long dormancy. She spoke calmly, methodically, as though she were filing a routine report rather than recording what might be her civilization's final words. The translation was rough, but Scholar Keth could hear the meaning beneath the approximations. She said, "Final status report. The endurance protocol is now active. All personnel are entering stasis as planned. The AI systems are online and will maintain watch for the duration. The fleet is secured and ready for activation on threat detection. We don't know how long this will take. We don't know if anyone will ever need us. But humanity made a choice. We chose to survive. We chose to ensure that if the threat returns, if it comes back after we're gone, after our civilization has faded, after everything we built has turned to dust, there will still be someone here to fight. We are the failsafe. We are the insurance policy against extinction. And we will wait as long as it takes." The recording ended. Scholar Keth sat in the silence that followed, feeling something cold settle into his chest. He understood now. Or at least, he understood enough to be terrified. These beings, these humans, had not died. They had not collapsed. They had not succumbed to plague or war or environmental catastrophe. They had deliberately erased their civilization from the surface of their world. They had removed every trace of their presence, had let their planet heal, had reduced their entire species to a skeleton crew of sleepers in hidden facilities. And they had done it because they were afraid of something. Something they called the threat. Something that had made them decide that the only way to guarantee their survival was to disappear. Curator Bess reviewed the translation 3 times. Then she called an emergency meeting of the senior research staff. They gathered in the Twilight Seekers conference chamber, and she shared Scholar Keth's findings. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. They needed to know more. They needed to understand what this threat was. They needed to find the fleet that Captain Shin had mentioned. Because if a civilization advanced enough to maintain functional stasis for 500,000 years had been frightened enough to erase itself, then whatever they had been afraid of was still relevant, still dangerous, still somewhere in the galaxy. The survey drones found the fleet 3 days later. It was not on Earth. It was not in the solar system. It was stationed in the outer reaches of the star systems or cloud, so far from the sun that the light was barely more than another star in the sky. The fleet was massive. Hundreds of vessels, each 1 kilometer long, arranged in a defensive formation around a central complex that the scan suggested was some kind of command and control facility. And like the polar installations, like the sleepers in their pods, the fleet was still powered, still functional, still waiting. The Twilight Seeker approached cautiously. Curator Vess had no desire to trigger whatever automated defenses might be protecting the fleet. They moved slowly, broadcasting peaceful intentions on every frequency they could generate, making their presence as obvious and non-threatening as possible. The fleet did not respond. It simply hung there in the darkness, ancient and patient, its hull plating so perfectly maintained that it looked like it had been built yesterday rather than in an age when most of the current galactic civilizations had not yet evolved sapience. The research team deployed remote probes to examine the vessels. What they found defied every assumption they had made about this vanished civilization. The ships were not primitive. They were not the crude first-generation star vessels that most species built when they first achieved interstellar flight. These were warships designed by beings who understood naval combat at a level that suggested centuries, maybe millennia, of development. The hull construction used materials that the archivist scanners could not fully identify. The weapon systems were dormant, but clearly sophisticated, incorporating principles of physics that the research team recognized but had never seen implemented with this level of refinement. And every single ship was equipped with what appeared to be artificial intelligence systems, still active, still monitoring, still maintaining the fleet's readiness after an impossible duration. One of the research team members, a weapons specialist who had been brought along to help identify any potential hazards, spent 2 days analyzing the largest vessel's armament. Then he presented his findings to Curator Vess in private. He looked shaken. He said, "I've studied military technology from 100 dead civilizations. I've seen everything from chemical explosives to quantum disruptors. These ships are using weapon systems that are theoretically possible but practically unachievable. The power requirements alone would exceed what most civilizations could generate with an entire planet's worth of infrastructure. Either these humans were phenomenally advanced, more advanced than anything else I've encountered in the archaeological record, or they were desperate enough to develop capabilities that should have been impossible. Maybe both." Curator Vess authorized a deeper investigation. The team needed to access one of the ships directly, to examine its systems, to try to understand what they were dealing with. They chose the smallest vessel, a craft that was still the size of a major city, but at least manageable in scope, and after days of careful scanning to ensure they would not trigger any defensive responses, they docked with it. The airlock accepted them. The interior was pressurized, temperature-controlled, perfectly preserved. And everywhere they looked, they found signs of the same meticulous preparation that had characterized the polar facilities. This was not a derelict. This was not an abandoned ship. This was a vessel on standby, waiting to be crewed, waiting to fulfill whatever purpose it had been designed for. They found the ship's central intelligence in the command deck. It was still active. Not conscious in the way that biological beings are conscious, but aware in some limited capacity, monitoring systems, running diagnostics, maintaining readiness. Scholar Keth attempted communication. He used the linguistic framework he had built from Captain Chen's log, constructing simple queries, hoping the AI would respond. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, a display activated. Text appeared. The translation algorithms processed it immediately. the AI said, in the approximation of human language that the archivists could understand. Identify! Scholar Keth responded carefully. He explained who they were, where they came from, what they were doing here. He emphasized that they meant no harm, that they were simply scholars trying to understand what had happened to Earth. The AI processed this for several minutes. Then it responded. Duration of absence query. Keth did not understand at first. Then he realized what it was asking. How long had it been since the humans had entered stasis? How long had the AI been waiting? He checked the dating analysis, converted it to a neutral temporal framework, and provided the answer. 500,000 years, approximately. The AI's response came immediately, and even through the imperfect translation, Scholar Keth could hear something in it that sounded like surprise. Duration exceeds mission parameters. Awaiting orders. Requesting contact with command authority. Curator Vess, monitoring the exchange from the ship, made a decision that would later be questioned by every oversight committee and historical review board in archivist space. She ordered the team to maintain communication with the AI. She ordered them to try to understand what its mission parameters were, what it was waiting for, what the threat was, because the answer to that question might be the most important piece of knowledge the archivists had ever uncovered. The AI, after what seemed like careful consideration, agreed to share information. And what it told them, over the course of the next 6 hours, rewrote everything the archivists thought they knew about the galaxy's history. The threat had a name. In the human language that the AI still spoke after 500,000 years, it was called the Devourers. The translation was approximate. The actual term carried connotations of consumption, annihilation, the absolute erasure of existence, but Devourers captured the essential meaning. They had come to human space 73,000 years before the humans entered stasis. They had come from a direction that the humans' astronomical charts indicated was outside the galactic plane entirely, from the vast intergalactic void where nothing was supposed to exist. They had not communicated. They had not negotiated. They had simply begun systematically destroying everything they encountered. The AI's records were fragmentary. Much had been lost or degraded over the millennia, but it had preserved the essential details. The Devourers were not a civilization in any conventional sense. They were something else. The human observers had never determined whether they were biological, mechanical, or some hybrid form. They traveled in vessels that violated several known laws of physics. They consumed matter and energy with perfect efficiency, leaving nothing behind but empty space. And they were patient. They did not rush. They did not make mistakes. They simply moved from system to system, world to world, methodically erasing everything they found. Humanity had fought them for 18,000 years. The war had consumed their entire civilization. They had militarized every aspect of their society, had converted every resource to the conflict, had developed weapons and strategies that pushed the boundaries of what their technology could achieve. They had won battles. They had destroyed Devourer vessels. They had learned to predict their movements, to counter their tactics. But the Devourers kept coming. For every vessel humanity destroyed, 10 more appeared. The war was not sustainable. Humanity was losing by attrition, slowly but inevitably, and they knew it. So they made a choice. They developed the Endurance Protocol. The plan was radical. Some of the AI's historical records suggested it had been deeply controversial within human leadership. They would evacuate their civilization from the surface. They would erase every trace of their presence, make their world look dead and empty, uninteresting to the Devourer's systematic consumption. They would hide their people in deep stasis, reduce their energy signatures to almost nothing and wait. Wait for the Devourers to pass through their space, find nothing worth consuming and move on. And they would maintain a fleet. a skeleton force of automated warships, and a small crew of volunteers in stasis, ready to activate if the Devourers returned, ready to fight if hiding failed. The AI's records indicated that the plan had worked. 55,000 years after humanity entered stasis, the Devourers had passed through the Sol system. They had scanned Earth. They had detected no signs of active civilization, no energy signatures worth investigating. They had moved on, continuing their slow march across the galaxy. And they had not returned. For 445,000 years, the AI had been monitoring, watching, waiting for the threat to come back. It had not. The Devourers had simply vanished into the vastness of the galaxy, pursuing whatever incomprehensible purpose drove them. Curator Vess listened to all of this in a state of growing horror. The archivists had been cataloging dead worlds for centuries. They had documented the ruins of thousands of civilizations. They had always assumed that each collapse was unique, the result of internal conflict, environmental failure, the specific challenges that each species faced. It had never occurred to them that there might be a pattern, a single external cause, something moving through the galaxy, systematically erasing civilizations, leaving only empty worlds behind. The Devourers explained everything. All those pristine dead worlds, empty and perfect, showing no signs of the usual collapse patterns. They had not collapsed. They had been consumed. Scholar Keth asked the AI a question that had been building in him since the translation started. He asked, "Are the Devourers still active? Are they still out there?" The AI's response was immediate and chilling. Threat status unknown. Last confirmed Devourer presence was 445,127 years ago. Probability of continued existence, high. Probability of return to this sector cannot be calculated with available data. Current mission status, maintain readiness. Await activation signal from Command Authority or detection of threat approach. Curator Vess made her second critical decision. She ordered the research team to begin a full historical analysis of the archivist's entire catalog of dead worlds. She wanted dating analysis on every single site. She wanted to know when each civilization had vanished. She wanted to map the timeline, to see if there was a pattern that they had missed. The analysis took 3 weeks. When it was complete, the results were devastating. There was a pattern. A wave of extinctions moving through the galaxy over the last 2 million years, progressing in a clear directional pattern from one sector to the next. The archivists had documented over 6,000 dead civilizations. 5,312 of them fell within the pattern. 5,312 civilizations, spread across 200,000 light-years, all vanishing within a temporal window that suggested a single cause moving at sublight speeds, systematically consuming everything in its path. And the pattern was still progressing. The most recent dead world the archivists had catalogued, a civilization that had been thriving just 12,000 years ago, fell exactly on the projected path. The Devourers were still out there. Still moving. Still consuming. And according to the pattern analysis, they were heading toward archivist space. They would arrive in approximately 37,000 years. Curator Vess stood in the observation deck of the Twilight Seeker, looking down at Earth. Beautiful, healed, peaceful Earth, with its hidden installations and sleeping guardians, and felt the weight of a decision that she had never wanted to make. The archivists were not warriors. They were scholars. Their entire civilization was built on the principle of peaceful documentation, of preserving knowledge without interfering in galactic affairs. But they had just discovered that the galaxy was facing an existential threat that had been consuming civilizations for millions of years. And they had found the only species that had ever successfully hidden from it, the only civilization that had developed a strategy for surviving it. The question was simple. What do you do with knowledge like that? Do you keep it secret, protect the sleeping humans from disturbance, honor their choice to wait for a threat that might never return? Or do you share it? Do you warn the galaxy? Do you risk waking something that has been dormant for 500,000 years, something that had built a fleet of warships so advanced that they frightened the researchers who studied them, something that had fought an 18,000-year war against an enemy that the current galactic civilization had no idea existed? Curator Vess called an emergency session of the Archivist High Council. It took 6 weeks for them to convene. They were scattered across 300 systems, and an emergency session was rare enough that many had to travel significant distances. She presented her findings. She showed them the facilities, the fleet, the AI's testimony. She showed them the pattern analysis, the evidence of the Devourer's continued existence. And she asked for guidance. The council deliberated for 5 days. The debate was intense, philosophical, touching on fundamental questions about the Archivist's purpose and principles. Finally, they reached a consensus. The galaxy needed to know. The threat was too large, too immediate, too catastrophic to keep secret. But the humans had made a choice, and that choice deserved respect. The council authorized Curator Vess to make contact with the AI, to explain the situation, and to ask permission to wake the human command staff. Not the entire fleet. Not all the sleepers. Just enough to establish communication, to verify the threat, to determine if the endurance protocol needed to be activated. The AI considered this request for 3 hours. Then it responded with a single word that the translation algorithms rendered as agreed. The process of waking someone from stasis after 500,000 years was not simple. The AI guided the Archivist medical team through the procedure with the patience of something that had been waiting for this moment for longer than most stars burned. The pod they chose was Captain Chin's, the command authority, the one whose voice they had heard in the recording, the one who had made the final report before the silence. The AI emphasized that the process would be gradual. The stasis systems were designed to preserve biological function perfectly, but reactivation required careful coordination of neurological, cardiovascular, and cellular processes that had been essentially frozen for an incomprehensible duration. It took 6 days. 6 days of slow, incremental increases in the pod's internal temperature, carefully modulated injections of compounds that the AI synthesized from the facility's medical stores, monitoring of biological functions so subtle that the Archivist instruments could barely detect them. And then, on the morning of the 7th day, the pod's display changed. Brain activity spiked. Respiratory function engaged. Cardiac rhythm established. The AI announced, with what might have been satisfaction or might have been relief. Revival successful. Subject conscious in 30 seconds. Captain Chinaiko opened her eyes to a world that no longer existed. She lay in her pod for a long moment, not moving, her expression perfectly neutral as though she were simply waking from an ordinary sleep rather than an absence that had lasted longer than human civilization had existed the first time around. Then she sat up. She looked at the pod's internal display, reading data that meant nothing to the watching archivists. She looked at the medical readouts. She looked at the date stamp. And then she spoke, her voice rough from disuse but clear. How long? The AI responded in the human language, the words untranslated but the tone somehow conveying respect. 500,214 years, Captain. Plus or minus 300 years accounting for temporal drift. Chin was silent for a long time. Then she said something that Scholar Ket's translation algorithms later rendered approximately as, well, that's longer than we planned. She climbed out of the pod with movements that were slow but steady, her body adapting to activity after its impossible rest. She was wearing the dark blue uniform that the archivists had seen through the pod's transparent surface. Some kind of military dress with rank insignia on the shoulders and a name tag on the chest. She stood for a moment, steadying herself, and then she seemed to notice for the first time that she was not alone. The archivist's medical team stood at what they hoped was a respectful distance, trying to appear non-threatening despite being members of a species that Captain Chen had never seen before. Curator Vess stepped forward carefully, using the translation interface that Scholar Keth had built. She introduced herself. She explained who the archivists were. She explained, as simply as she could, what had happened to Earth, to humanity's civilization, to the 500,000 years that had passed. Chen listened without interrupting. Her expression remained neutral, controlled, professional. When Curator Vess finished, Chen asked 3 questions in rapid succession. Is the fleet operational? Is the AI functional? Are any devourers detected in this sector? Curator Vess answered carefully. Yes, the fleet was operational. Yes, the AI was functional. No, there were no devourers detected in this immediate sector, but, and this was the critical piece of information, the pattern analysis suggested they were still active elsewhere in the galaxy. Chen absorbed this information. Then she asked to see the pattern analysis. Curator Vess had anticipated this request. She had brought the full dataset, the mapping, the timeline, everything the archivists had compiled. She displayed it on a portable interface, and Chen studied it with the focused intensity of someone reading tactical data rather than historical research. After 10 minutes, Chen said quietly, "You've mapped 5,000 extinctions, 5,000 civilizations, 500,000 years." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flat tone of someone processing something too large for emotional response. Then she looked at Curator Vess directly and asked, "Why did you wake me?" Curator Vess explained. She explained the archivist's mission, their commitment to preserving knowledge, their belief that the galaxy needed to understand the threat it was facing. She explained that they had not wanted to disturb the humans' rest, but that the evidence suggested the devourers were still active, still consuming civilizations, still moving through the galaxy. She explained that 37,000 years seemed like a long time, but in galactic terms it was nothing, and that preparing for a threat of this magnitude required resources and coordination that would take millennia to organize. She explained, as clearly as she could, that humanity's experience, their war, their strategy, their survival, might be the only knowledge that could help the galaxy prepare for what was coming. Chen listened to all of this. Then she turned to the AI and spoke in rapid human language that the translators struggled to keep up with. The conversation lasted several minutes. Then she turned back to Curator Vess and said, in carefully chosen words, that the translation interface rendered more clearly than anything she had said before. "I need to wake my command staff. I need to assess the fleet. I need to review the full scope of what you've discovered. And then, I need to make a decision about whether we activate the endurance protocol or whether we do something that we never planned for." She paused, and for the first time since waking, something other than professional control showed on her face. It might have been grief, or exhaustion, or resignation. "We built all of this to protect humanity. We went to sleep so that someday, if the devourers came back, there would be someone here to fight. We never imagined we'd be waking up to protect anyone else." Over the next 30 days, Captain Chen systematically reactivated her command staff. 12 people, all of them military specialists, all of them chosen because they understood what they were signing up for when they entered the pods 500,000 years ago. Each reactivation followed the same careful protocol. Each person woke to the same impossible news. And each person, after the initial shock faded, fell back on training, on discipline, on the particular kind of professionalism that military organizations cultivate in people who might need to function under incomprehensible circumstances. They assessed the fleet. They reviewed the archivist's data. They consulted with the AI systems that had maintained their vigil through the centuries. And they planned. Captain Chen presented her recommendation to Curator Vez 6 weeks after her reactivation. She said, "The Endurance Protocol was designed for one scenario. Devourers return to Earth. We fight them here. We protect humanity's last refuge. That's not what's happening. The Devourers are out there, moving toward inhabited space that has no idea what's coming. We can do 3 things. 1. We can go back to sleep, stick to the original plan, wait for the threat to reach us. 2. We can activate the full fleet, wake everyone, and use our resources to defend Earth when the time comes. 3. We can do something that we never planned for, but that might be the right thing anyway. We can share what we know. We can help the galaxy prepare. And if necessary, we can fight alongside them when the Devourers arrive." She paused. "My command staff has voted 11-1 in favor of option 3. The dissenting vote was mine. I think sticking to the plan is safer. But I'm overruled by my own officers, which means they're probably right, and I'm being too cautious." The activation of Earth's ancient war fleet was not a sudden dramatic event. It was a slow, careful process that took 8 months of preparation. The archivists worked alongside the human command staff, providing resources, facilitating communication, helping to bridge the gap between a civilization that had been dormant for 500,000 years and a galaxy that had evolved without any knowledge of their existence. The fleet's AI systems were upgraded with current stellar cartography. The command staff reviewed galactic political structures, learned about the species that now inhabited the galaxy, studied the technological baseline of current civilizations. And slowly, carefully, they began the process of waking the rest of their people. Not everyone. Not yet. They woke specialists first. Engineers to assess and modernize the fleet systems. Scientists to analyze the archivist's data on the Devourers. Diplomats to help navigate the complex task of introducing themselves to a galaxy that would have no framework for understanding what they were. But the message was clear. Humanity's long sleep was ending. Not because the Devourers had returned to Earth, but because something more important had happened. They had learned that they were not alone. That other civilizations existed, thrived, created beauty and meaning in life. And that those civilizations were in danger from a threat that humanity knew how to fight. The announcement was made at the Galactic Collective's annual summit, 3 months after the first human ships emerged from Earth's Oort cloud and entered inhabited space. The Collective was not a government. The galaxy was far too diverse for anything resembling unified governance, but it was a forum where civilizations could meet, share information, and coordinate on matters of mutual interest. The archivists had arranged for humanity to present their findings to the full assembly. 2,000 species sent representatives. The chamber was vast, designed to accommodate radically different biologies and atmospheric requirements. And when Captain Chen walked to the central podium, every eye, sensor, and attention mechanism in the room focused on her with the intensity of beings confronting something they had never imagined encountering. Chen spoke for 2 hours. She explained humanity's history. The war with the Devourers, the Endurance Protocol, the decision to erase their civilization from the galaxy's awareness. She presented the archivist's pattern analysis, the evidence of 5,000 extinctions, the mathematical modeling that suggested the Devourers were still active. She showed footage from the ancient war, recordings that the fleet's AI had preserved, showing battles between human vessels and the strange impossible ships that the Devourers deployed. The footage was terrifying. It showed weapons that violated known physics. It showed tactics that suggested intelligence but not consciousness. It showed humanity's ships, cruder than the current fleet but still formidable, dying in battles against an enemy that seemed to learn from every engagement, adapting in real time, becoming more efficient with each encounter. When she finished, the chamber was silent. Then the questions began. Some were skeptical. How could humanity prove that the Devourers were real, that they weren't just a legend from a dead civilization? Chen responded by inviting the questioners to review the archivist's independent analysis, to examine the pattern of extinctions that no single civilization could have fabricated. Some were practical. How much time did the galaxy have before the Devourers arrived? Chen was honest. The models suggested somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years, but models could be wrong, and the Devourers' behavior was not perfectly predictable. Some were philosophical. Why should the current galactic civilizations trust a species that had been dead for 500,000 years? To that question, Chen had no perfect answer. She said simply, "You shouldn't trust us because we're human. You should trust the data. You should trust the archivists, who have no reason to lie. And you should trust the fact that we didn't have to wake up. We didn't have to reveal ourselves. We could have stayed hidden, waited for the threat to pass us by again, let the rest of the galaxy discover the Devourers the same way we did, by dying to them. But we're here because we remember what it's like to face an existential threat alone. We remember what it costs. And we decided that if we could help you avoid paying that cost, we should." The debate in the collective lasted 6 weeks. Species argued, formed coalitions, broke apart and reformed around different positions. Some wanted to reject humanity's warning entirely, to treat it as a curiosity rather than a threat. Some wanted to accept the warning but refuse humanity's help, unwilling to rely on a civilization with capabilities that frightened them. Some wanted to embrace full cooperation, to begin immediate galactic-scale preparation for a threat that was still millennia away. The archivists, who had brought this situation to the collective's attention, worked tirelessly to provide additional data, to answer questions, to mediate between factions. Finally, a consensus emerged. Not unanimous, the galaxy was too diverse for unanimity, but sufficient. The collective would accept humanity's warning. They would begin coordinating research into the Devourers, sharing data across civilizations, developing defensive strategies. And they would accept humanity's offer to share their military knowledge, their war experience, their understanding of an enemy that no current civilization had ever faced. In exchange, humanity asked for 2 things: resources to fully activate their fleet and bring their entire population out of stasis, and the recognition that Earth and its solar system would remain sovereign human territory, not subject to collective authority or interference. The terms were accepted. And so began what historians would later call the Great Preparation, a 30,000-year effort to ready the galaxy for a threat that most of the citizens would never live to see. Humanity became, in a strange twist of fate, the galaxy's military advisors. Not its conquerors. Not its rulers. Its teachers. They shared everything they knew about fighting the Devourers. They helped species develop weapons systems, tactical doctrines, defensive strategies. They trained officers from 1,000 different civilizations in the principles of asymmetric warfare against an enemy with superior technology. And they rebuilt their own civilization, not as it had been 500,000 years ago, but as something new, something adapted to a galaxy that had evolved in their absence. It was not easy. There were conflicts, misunderstandings, moments when the cultural gap between humanity and the rest of the galaxy seemed unbridgeable. Some species feared humans, saw them as dangerous relics from a violent age, who might decide to conquer rather than cooperate. Some humans struggled with the reality that their civilization was now a minority in a galaxy full of strangers, that Earth was no longer humanity's private refuge, but part of a larger community. But both sides learned. Both sides adapted. Because the alternative, facing the Devourers unprepared, was too terrible to contemplate. 15,000 years after humanity's reactivation, the Devourers entered the outer rim of galactic space. The warning came from deep space monitoring stations that had been built specifically to detect their approach. The signature was unmistakable, the same physics-violating energy emissions that humanity's ancient records had documented, the same systematic consumption pattern that had destroyed 5,000 civilizations. The galaxy had been preparing for this moment for 150 centuries. Every major civilization had defensive fleets. Every strategic choke point had fortifications. Every inhabited system had evacuation protocols and fallback positions. And at the center of the defensive coordination, humanity's fleet, now expanded, modernized, but still built on the same principles that had kept them fighting for 18,000 years the first time, stood ready. Captain Chen was no longer leading the fleet. She had been dead for 12,000 years, having lived a second life in the galaxy she had woken to, having seen humanity integrate into galactic civilization, having passed command to younger officers who had been born in this new age. But her legacy endured. The tactical doctrines she had helped develop, the cultural bridge she had built between humanity and the galaxy, the choice she had made to share her people's knowledge rather than hoard it. That choice had given the galaxy something it had never had before, a chance to survive. The war lasted 8,000 years. It was brutal, costly, incomprehensible in its scale. Civilizations fell. Systems were evacuated. Entire sectors became battlegrounds where reality itself seemed to break down under the strain of weapons that should not have existed. But the galaxy did not fall. It held. It adapted. It learned. And eventually, slowly, it began to push back. Humanity's contribution was significant but not singular. They fought alongside 1,000 other species, each one bringing their own strengths, their own innovations, their own desperate courage to the conflict. And when the final Devourer vessel was destroyed, cornered in a dying star system, overwhelmed by a combined fleet representing 200 civilizations, humanity's ships were there, but so were the archivists, the collective members, the species that had been strangers 15,000 years ago and were now allies. In the aftermath, when the galaxy counted its losses and began the long process of rebuilding, historians tried to calculate humanity's impact. They tried to quantify what difference it had made, humanity waking up, sharing their knowledge, fighting alongside everyone else. The calculations were complex, the variables too numerous for perfect accuracy. But the consensus estimate was this: without humanity's intervention, the galaxy would have lost. Not immediately, not in the first engagements, but over time, as the Devourers adapted and the civilizations fell one by one, the outcome would have been inevitable. Humanity had changed the equation. They had given the galaxy time, knowledge, and hope, and that had been enough. 500,000 years after humans disappeared from Earth's surface, choosing sleep over extinction, choosing to wait rather than accept defeat, their descendants stood among the stars as full members of a galactic community that had survived because of them. Not conquered it, not ruled it, simply helped it. And in the end, that was a legacy worth waking up for.